So welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Noreen Flanagan. I am a psychiatrist and the director of behavioral health at Synapticure. Welcome to today's webinar on mindfulness. Synapticure values mindfulness therapies as part of our mental health programming for our patients. There's a lot of research supporting the benefits of mindfulness for mental health, especially to help with symptoms like grief, anxiety, depression, insomnia, and for cognition. So you'll hear more about this today. And with that, I'd like to introduce two of our Synapticure team members who will be hosting this webinar. Dr. Tracey Meyers, who you see on the screen now, and Dr. Liz Ferluga, who is navigating the Zoom world complexities that arose, with tech. So starting with Dr. Meyers. Dr. Meyers is a clinical neuropsychologist who has had over 25 years of experience in neurodegenerative diseases and mental health. She has a strong commitment to integrative medicine for mental health and wellness, and she leads mindfulness groups here at Synapticure. She also provides individual therapy and is an advanced yoga instructor. Dr. Meyers has been teaching and integrating mindfulness meditation into clinical practice for over 15 years and has a number of mindfulness meditation certifications, including MBSR, Mindful Self-Compassion, Breath, Body, Mind, and Yoga Nidra. She has authored several publications and is licensed in 37 states. We are incredibly grateful to be able to work with and have Synapticure patients be able to see Dr. Meyers for therapy. Joining us shortly will be Dr. Liz Ferluga. Dr. Ferluga is a movement disorders neurologist who has been in practice for 16 years. She graduated from medical school at the University of Iowa with honors, completed residency at Vanderbilt, where she was also chief resident, and completed her neurology fellowship there as well. Dr. Ferluga has developed 2 movement disorders clinics over her career and joined Synapticure last year with a focus on holistic care for patients with Parkinson's and Huntington's diseases. Dr. Ferluga is a dedicated mom to 4 cats who unfortunately will not be joining us for today's webinar. So without further ado, I know Dr. Meyers has a lot to inform us on tonight about mindfulness. So I'll let you get started, Tracey, and when Dr. Ferluga comes on, we'll say a quick hello.
That sounds great. Thanks, Noreen. So thank you all for coming tonight and really your interest in mindfulness and learning how it might be supportive along your journey. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about. As Noreen shared, I've been integrating mindfulness for many years as part of psychotherapy and also as a standalone practice to support well-being, to help people reduce anxiety, improve mood, and also just generally to feel better. So tonight I'm going to share a little bit about the background of what mindfulness is and what it isn't. We're going to explore different kinds of practices, so you'll have some direct opportunities to practice. And those of you who may not have practiced before or maybe have struggled with mindfulness, hopefully you'll have a sense of how many options there are to find really what works for you. So it's not one size fits all, and each person will have their own sort of unique practice that might support them. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get into a little bit of the science, how in particular mindfulness can support neurodegenerative diseases and mental health. So I'm going to begin. All right. So I want to start with a little practice. Like, why not? If we're going to talk about mindfulness, it's really important to actually have a little taste. So I don't know about you all, but I have certainly been in this young lady's position here where I have tried to sit down, especially in the early days of doing mindfulness meditation. And I'm like, am I doing this right? This doesn't seem right. And I start to get distracted. My thoughts go off onto other things. And before I know it, I don't even know if I've done anything right? So if that has been the case for you, then do not worry. That is really part of the practice, which is beginning to notice what happens when we slow down and pause. So I'm going to guide us now in just maybe a minute or 2 practice, just to get a taste of what this mindfulness process is all about. And for those of you who have a regular practice, this will feel like just a kind of grounding and centering practice. All right, so I'm going to invite you now, if you would like, to either close your eyes or lower your gaze, just looking away from the screen. And that's not mandatory. If you want to keep your eyes open, of course, you can do that as well. And I'm going to invite you for this moment just to begin to notice your breath. So you don't need to change your breath in any way. You don't have to breathe deeper or inhale deeper, just taking a moment to notice your breathing. And then maybe noticing where you feel the breath in your body. Do you notice the belly rising and falling? Do you notice your lungs filling and emptying? For some of us, we might notice air coming in and out of the nose or the mouth. Just noticing this breath. And then beginning to soften and let go of any unnecessary tension in the body. Seeing if you might soften areas of the body that might be holding tension. And if that's not possible in this moment, just imagining the body finding a little bit more ease. Can you soften areas or imagine softening areas of the body that don't need to be holding tension in the moment? And then returning to the breath, just 2 more breaths, simply coming back into this present moment, noticing the breath and the body. And then when you're ready, I'm going to invite you to open your eyes if your eyes were closed, and gently coming back to the space you're in. And just notice what that was like. If anyone is willing to put in chat, maybe how that was, just to do this brief practice. What did you notice? How did you feel? So this is just a little taste. Now we're going to go on, but I wanted to have you really sort of explore what it means to come into the present moment. So why are we talking about mindfulness, and what does that have to do with ALS and Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions? Well, there's been a lot of research about mindfulness, which I'm going to share as we go on in the presentation today. But in particular, recent research over the past few years has shown how mindfulness and mindfulness-focused interventions might improve neuropsychiatric symptoms that come along with some of the neurological disorders that some of you are living with. Mindfulness has been shown especially helpful in terms of preventing depression or reducing depression, helping decrease anxiety, and even supporting a decrease in chronic pain. A study in 2017 recently showed that in Parkinson's disease, there's evidence that mindfulness-based interventions can reduce psychological distress and improve clinical symptoms. So the research is continuing to show us that some of the common mental health challenges when living with a neurodegenerative condition can be improved or at least stabilized using some of these principles of mindfulness meditation. So we're going to talk about how that all works. So first, let's start with a definition of mindfulness. Many of you are familiar with the term, right? We hear it a lot over the past several years, how mindfulness can help with all sorts of things. But what does it actually mean? So Jon Kabat-Zinn, who some of you may know that name, he really is credited with bringing mindfulness into modern medicine. In 1979, John Kabat-Zinn created a program called the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. And he started it at University of Massachusetts. And what he found was he created an 8-week program for people that were living with chronic pain. And what he found was over a course of 8 weeks, by simply practicing mindfulness on a daily basis, people started reporting less pain, better mood, better overall quality of life. So since 1979, John Kabat-Zinn has trained thousands of people, created many clinics across the world that have started using his model. I was one of his students way back in the 2000s, one of his proteges from University of Massachusetts, and loved how this practice can be utilized across so many different types of settings, in medicine, in schools, in prisons, in inpatient units. So it's a super helpful way to begin to jumpstart a program, is to utilize some of the principles that John talks about. So he talks about mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So we just did that, right? Hopefully, we paid attention to our breath on purpose, and we just watched what happened, right? And 2 other researchers came after John Kabat-Zinn. They created a book, which is fantastic, called the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook. And Stahl and Goldstein talked about mindfulness consisting of awareness of the mind and the body and living in the here and now. So these are just 2 easy definitions just to kind of wrap your head around what mindfulness is. So what is mindfulness meditation? Mindfulness meditation is this intentional practice of attending to the stream of awareness in the present moment without judgment, right? You hear that definition. And it's a practice, meaning that we do it for a period of time. So we can do it sitting, we can do it standing, we can do it for a few minutes, all the way up to hours if we were so inclined. And there are many different kinds of meditation. So I saw someone put in the Q&A early on about not liking meditation, and you're not alone. There are many people that traditional breathing meditation isn't helpful, doesn't work, can create more stress. So in that case, we can try mindfulness of sounds using guided imagery, visualization. For some people who prefer to be moving, we might do a meditation in motion, like yoga or walking meditation. So it doesn't actually matter what the practice is. It's the intentional practice of steadying the mind and focusing on the present moment. And I'm going to give us some tips toward the end today of some short practices, just to get a handle on ways that you might integrate it without a lot of difficulty. Okay. I want to pause for a moment now because I see Dr. Ferluga has joined us. Liz, are you able to pop on for a moment and just introduce yourself? I wanted to make sure you got to say hi and introduce yourself here.
Well, it's not letting me put my video on right this second, but I wanted to say hello to everyone out there. I'm one of the movement disorder neurologists. I'll see if I can get my video on a little later.
Thank you. Okay. And I see chat is disabled. Thank you for letting me know that. And I'm not sure that I can do anything. So we'll use our Q&A instead of chat. Okay. So thank you for letting me know that. All right. So how does mindfulness actually help with mental health? So I've shared a little bit about how it can be supportive in terms of decreasing depression, improving quality of life, a sense of well-being, but what actually is happening? So I'm going to talk a little bit about stress, something that most of us are familiar with, right? And talk a little bit about where mindfulness can fit in when we are undergoing stress. So this is a very simple definition of stress, really looking at the mind-body connection. So we're faced, when a person's faced with a stressor, right? We'll pick a very simple one tonight, like getting onto Zoom for Dr. Ferluga, right? Something that feels like, uh-oh, something's wrong, right? And then we think about the situation. Is it safe or is it dangerous, right? we're trying to appraise the situation, right? And if we think that, oh no, something terrible is going to happen, our resources get overwhelmed quickly. And what can happen, we can get an imbalance in our nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system, which gets us ready when there's a stressful situation, it's our fight, flight, freeze response, can get activated. And it shoots adrenaline and cortisol into our bodies. We're ready to mobilize, right? And if too much of that sympathetic hyperarousal happens, we end up feeling really, really stressed, right? So I'll describe this in another way. Here's another example. So potentially stressful event, could be anything, right? Could be getting an email from somebody, or getting a medical diagnosis, or having to have a test, right? And again, how we think about that situation. Do we feel like it's safe or dangerous? If we start to think about what might go wrong, for example, we can get really anxious. So we have this stressor, then we have the appraisal, how we think about the situation. And then we have three things that happen. One, we have an emotional response, which could be fear, anxiety, annoyance. We can have a physiological response, like those hormones, like adrenaline and cortisol moving through the nervous system. And then we can have a behavioral response. We can get angry. We could blame ourselves or someone else. We could drink alcohol. We could binge watch Netflix. So none of these are bad, but these are ways that we cope when we're under stress, right? So we have a stressor, how we perceive the stressor, and then an emotional, physiological, and behavioral response. Well, what happens when we have too much stress in our system? All of us have what we call this window of tolerance. And this research comes from Daniel Siegel, and other neurobiologists have really studied the effect of trauma and stress on the nervous system. And what they found is, on a good day, when things are going well, most of us have a pretty good window of tolerance. That means that we're feeling good, we can handle things pretty well, we're mentally focused, right? And so this is like the ideal day, right? And it doesn't mean there's no stress, but it means that generally you're able to manage stress pretty effectively. But then something happens. You get a call from, your child who's sick, or your boss wants you to meet a deadline, or your medication wasn't ordered properly, right? And we go into this little red zone here, hyperarousal, where we get stressed. We can feel that fight-flight system. We get emotionally distressed. Now, for many of us, that might happen, and 2 or 3 minutes later, we're able to go back into our window of tolerance, right? So we go into the red zone and then we come back. But what happens if we're having multiple times a day of getting triggered, stressed, anxious? Or what if we've had a lot of trauma in our life? So we've already been primed to get stressed pretty easily. Well, what happens for many of us is we start to live more in this red zone, right? Where we're easily activated and it takes a long time to calm down. So in fact, our window of tolerance on a good day is really wide, but if we have enough stress, our window of tolerance shrinks. And so even small things can begin to make us feel stressed and anxious, right? Now you see a little hint here already that mindfulness can help, but I'll save that part for a few minutes. I also want to share about this gray zone here, and some of you may relate to this. If we have enough stress in our system, and if we stay in the red zone long enough, what happens for many of us is we end up shutting down. And when we shut down, we can end up getting depressed, numb, dissociated, spacey, unmotivated, and kind of really sleepy, low energy, right? And for many of us, this can feel kind of bad too, right? So we end up cycling from the hyperarousal to the hypoarousal. And what happens to our window of tolerance? It starts to shrink more and more. And so for many people, we kind of get stuck in this red and gray back and forth, right? And this is not your fault. This is just happening on a nervous system level. When we have too much stress in our system, our nervous system's just trying to regulate. It's trying to do its best. And sometimes our window of tolerance is just exceeded and we don't have that capacity. So of course, it would be great to say the goal is to reduce stress. That would be wonderful. But most of us don't have that ability to reduce stress. And instead, what we want to work on is ways that we can get back into our window of tolerance, right? How can we manage if we're getting a lot of stressful information coming in? What do? How do we not stay in that red zone or shut down? And so again, we're going to start to move into the mindfulness discussion, but you can see here how mindfulness, grounding, and breath work help both when we're over aroused and also when we're under aroused, when we're shutting down. Okay, can play a role in both of those areas. So for many people living with neurodegenerative conditions, there has been trauma, the diagnosis itself, being around medical situations that are traumatic, right? So there's trauma in our nervous systems, and then never mind living in a complicated world these days, right? So what these researchers, these neuroscientists have found is that enough trauma in the system, again, can cause us to either vacillate between the hyper and the hypoarousal. So when stress and trauma shrink your window of tolerance, it doesn't take you much to throw you off balance, right? So again, some compassion for yourself. And working with someone who can help you with that, particularly around using some of these mind-body practices, is one of the ways we can work on increasing the window of tolerance, right? So where does mindfulness fit into this whole thing? So first, I want to say that there's been so much research on mindfulness over the past 20 to 25 years. Now, I'm dating myself, but when I was trained way back into the 1990s now, in graduate school in psychology, mindfulness was not a typical intervention. We did not receive training on how to do mindfulness. We didn't really even talk that much about the mind-body connection. So my focus when I was trained originally was more on neuropsychology, cognitive behavioral interventions, all about the mind, right? But after Jon Kabat-Zinn, people like Herbert Benson, who wrote the relaxation response in the 1970s and 80s, practitioners started to have a feeling that, hey, this mindfulness piece may start to work. So Kabat-Zinn and others started doing experiments. And suddenly there was this proliferation of mindfulness and how it might help with mental health. So now we go all the way, of course, even now we're 5 years later, the research continues on a daily, weekly basis to grow. And more research is being done with people that are living with chronic illnesses as well. One research study that I love is a kind of a fun study done way back now in 2010. It's called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And I love this because it's going to go back to the whole window of tolerance thing in a moment. But these researchers out of Harvard decided to randomly utilize an app on the iPhone, asking people throughout the day what they were doing, basically asking, are you paying attention to what you're doing? And how happy are you with what you're doing? All right, so this app would go off randomly and the person had to stop and write, yes, I'm doing this, or no, I'm not doing this. Am I paying attention to what I'm doing? And how happy am I on a scale of very bad to very good? So what these researchers found, and this study was done across the world. They had subjects from age 18 to, I think, 90. But what they found is that people's minds wander a lot. In fact, about 47% of our waking hours during a day, our minds are actually wandering and not paying attention to what we're doing. So you probably have noticed that even during this webinar that your mind wanders, right? Our minds naturally wander a lot. So that is interesting. But here's the really interesting part of the study. What they found was that when people's minds wander, they are less happy. Even if their minds are wandering about something like planning a vacation or reminiscing about something. When our minds wander, we're less happy. And so why the study was so important is that it gave researchers and clinicians like myself this kind of idea of like, oh, if people are unhappy because they're distracted, their minds are wandering, well, is the inverse true? If we actually start to pay attention, what happens? And interestingly, the research shows that the more that we're able to pay attention in the present moment, even for parts of the day, we're not talking about changing, suddenly now paying attention 100% of the time. It'd be impossible because our minds do naturally wander. But if we're able to integrate mindfulness more and more, we have more and more opportunities to feel better by just paying attention and being in the present moment. We're literally using different parts of the brain when we're in the present moment. We're utilizing the frontal lobes that can help us to feel and problem solve and plan. It taps into compassion and empathy. Again, different parts of the brain than the part that's planning, worrying, and getting stuck on a negative thought. So we're using a different network called the present-centered network in the brain when we're in the present moment, which is super cool, right? So how does this affect mental health? So earlier I showed about neurodegenerative conditions, but in general, across the board, mindfulness has shown to reduce psychological distress, decrease depression severity, improve the management of anxiety, improve attention and focus, which I haven't spoken about, but you could see how by being in the present moment, by paying attention, we start to change our capacity to focus, right? For many of us, we're highly distracted, especially in this age of technology and smartphones and all the ways that we're interrupted. But mindfulness is the opposite. It helps us to focus for a period of time. And research shows that if we do that on a regular basis, we actually improve our concentration skills. The areas of the brain that help us concentrate are being strengthened each time we stay in the present moment. And then overall, it can increase our sense of well-being. So I'd like to offer another practice, since again, this is sort of a practice and scientific discussion. So I want you all to be part of this little scientific experiment with me. And we're going to do a little bit more introduction around breathing, okay? And so a couple of things I want to say about the practice of mindfulness of breathing. It's not about deepening the breath, forcing the breath, or trying to do anything but just simply becoming aware of the sensations of our breath. Now, for those of you who find focusing on the breath to be more anxiety producing, or if you're having trouble with breathing, you're having respiration issues, you're coming off of a cold, a cough, COVID, or your condition is making it hard to breathe, I'm going to invite you to use a different focus. So I'm going to use mindfulness of breathing, but then I'm going to shift and have us practice with mindfulness of sounds. So those of us who find breath awareness not to be as helpful, we're going to get an opportunity to practice with sounds, okay? But the goal is the same. When we're in the present moment, we want to be aware of the sensations. And then when we notice our minds wandering, we simply redirect ourselves back to the present moment. That's it, just two directions. Pay attention to the sensation and then notice when your mind wanders. Now, people will often say, well, if my mind is wandering, I must be doing it wrong. Here's the good news. You're actually doing it right. As soon as you notice that your mind is wandering, that's a moment of mindfulness. You're doing it right. Remember, our minds are going to wander. They wander about 47% of the time, no matter what. So it's not stopping our minds. It's just simply noticing with kindness, non-judgmentally. My mind wandered. I was thinking, okay, I'm going to come back to the present moment. All right. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I make it sound easy. It's not easy, but it is something that we get to practice. Just like, anything. If we wanted to learn how to play the piano or do an exercise, it takes time. So we're going to build that muscle of mindfulness nice and slow today. Okay. A couple of other things. If you're doing mindfulness of breathing, we want to sit in a relaxed way. If we sit very rigid and uptight, it's really hard to relax the breath. So we want to sit in a way that is easy, but not slumped over, if that's available. And if that's not available, that's totally fine. You can be resting in bed and doing this practice. That's one of the things I love about mindfulness. It is completely portable. You can be doing it sitting, standing, laying down, walking, or anything in between, right? You can't get it wrong. So the goal is to find a position where you can find the most ease possible. Okay, so maybe I'm going to have you do that now as you hear me give the rest of the instructions. So find a position that's relaxed, whatever works for your body today. We're not going to force the breath, right? And so the breath can just be whatever it is and how it's showing up. Our goal is not to think about breathing, but it's just to sense it in the body. The anchor is the breath, but for some of us, we're going to use sounds, and I'm going to do both. So we'll do about half of the practice with breath and then half with sound. But if you notice right away that the breath is not supportive for you, please feel free to use meditation of sounds around you, okay? When the mind wanders, we're going to gently, non-judgmentally bring it back to the present moment. All right, so you ready? We'll start. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, just so we have a moment to collect ourselves, move away from the PowerPoint, okay? And when you're ready, just finding a position that feels relaxed, and see if there's even maybe a few adjustments that would make you even 5% more at ease. I'm going to invite you to begin to bring your attention to your breath. If you'd like to soften your gaze or close your eyes, feel free to do that. And once again, just becoming aware of your breathing. Those of you who want to use sound, perhaps beginning to tune into sounds around you. So as we continue to tune into the breath, perhaps beginning to notice the different sensations of breathing. You might notice the in-breath as the abdomen rises, and the out-breath as the abdomen falls. It's this simple experience of breathing. Perhaps noticing where the breath feels most pleasant. Maybe there's warmth coming in and out of the nose. Maybe the belly feels nice and soft as you breathe out. And simply noticing the breath. When the mind wanders, which it will, you can just gently return it to the next breath. Softly breathing in and gently breathing out. And then we'll begin to expand our awareness to include the sounds around you. Opening the sensory organ of the hearing of your ears. Noticing sounds that are close by. And maybe sounds in the distance. And simply letting the sounds come to you. No need to judge or identify the sounds. Just becoming aware of the sounds. Again, when the mind wanders, just gently bringing it back, noticing this sound. Just taking in the soundscape. Sounds are always in the present moment. You might even notice the space between sounds. So we'll come to the end of this practice. So perhaps taking a moment to come back to the breath. And then when you're ready, invite you to open your eyes. And just notice how you feel after that practice. I'm happy if anyone wants to put in a Q&A, even though it's not chat, but how you felt. I'd be happy to hear how that practice was. All right, and I'm going to continue to share. So this practice was mindfulness of breathing and sounds. And of course, there are many other kinds of practices that we can do as well. That was our mindfulness practice here. Oh, I'm just reading a couple of you said, relaxed, I'm yawning, so relaxed, I almost fell asleep. So that does happen. And thank you for sharing that, especially in the evening hours. You know, when our body starts to relax, sometimes we notice we're tired, right? And so sleeping and falling asleep is not a bad thing, right? It can definitely happen when we start to feel a little bit more ease in our system. So I'm never disappointed when someone tells me they got sleepy or felt tired. Yeah. So how does this all work? I talked a little bit about the brain and the neural networks that happen in the brain, right? The presence-centered network when we're focused and doing mindfulness, and our regular default network when we're not practicing mindfulness. But what are some of the underlying mechanisms? So one thing that researchers have really looked at is that when we're practicing mindfulness, we are ruminating less and worrying less. So if you think about thinking, right, most of the time we're either anticipating or worrying, or we're getting stuck in the past, we're ruminating, right? And so one of the ways that mindfulness is really helpful is that we're in the present moment. We're just being present with what is. So that repetitive negative thought process that happens for all of us starts to quiet down, even for a few moments, right? And for many of us, this is a welcome respite from our very worried, busy mind, right? All of us get stuck in worried patterns, right? So when we can reduce that, even for a few minutes, it can make us feel better. The second part is self-compassion. When we're paying attention to our breath and our body, taking in what's happening around us, we tend to be kinder to ourselves. We're moving from the judging and sometimes feeling really bad about ourselves into just this more neutral, just what's here right now. It can help us with emotional reactivity. When we're in that red zone, that hyperarousal, often we're really gripped with a lot of emotional reactivity. Our nervous system's telling us something's wrong. When we're practicing, we start to feel less reactive. And in fact, I'm going to show you a couple of practices to do when you're really reactive. Because when we're reactive, we tend to react in ways that are not always great, right? We might yell at somebody, we might get upset at ourselves, we might throw things, you know, who knows, right? We've all had those moments. So mindfulness can help us decrease our emotional reactivity so that we're more skillful in how we respond, right? So we can move from reacting to what we call responding, right? Which is more mindful. And finally, psychological flexibility. When we can train our minds to be more present, we actually have more capability to train our minds in general, right? So research has shown that psychological flexibility, the ability to pay attention, the ability to change our focus like we did from breath to sounds, we're using our brain in a different way. We're strengthening our capacity to be more flexible. And when we're more flexible, we're able to manage challenges more effectively. So a lot is happening even in 5 minutes of mindfulness practice. So what are ways that we can do this? So I think, you know, like I said earlier, there could be thousands of different mindfulness practices, but I like to think about informal and formal practices that we can do every day. I think about mindfulness as snacks. I love to snack, right? A little bite here, a little bite here. And that's really what I'm talking about tonight. Each time we can pay attention for a few minutes at a time, or even a moment at a time, we're increasing the benefits of the practice. So how can we do it informally? Well, I said snack, and I kind of mean it in some ways, like when we take a bite of chocolate, for example, right? Or we take a sip of tea, something that tastes good. Usually we're on our phones or doing something at the same time. When we're paying attention to what we're doing, like eating or like smelling the aroma of coffee in the morning, that's an informal way. That's a way to just briefly but potently pay attention, right? So if we did that 10 times a day, just a moment of paying attention. Or when we're hugging our, loved one or petting our dog, we're paying attention to what we're doing. Those are informal moments that we can string together. And each time we do that, we're paying attention. And then we couple that with a 5-minute breath practice or mindfulness of sounds or a loving awareness practice, which I'll share in a moment. Those are all ways we can do it formally, which means we can use, a bit of time to do that. So for some of us, maybe we do that for 5 or 10 minutes a day. The goal, I don't know, for the researchers say that even 5 or 10 minutes can make a difference. I'd argue that add that with those little snacks, we're getting a much more potent package, right? Ideally, we can work our way up to about 20 minutes a day. That's kind of just like exercise, that's like this nice amount to really get sustainable changes in our mood and in our ability to focus, right? But some days we may not get to that, right? And so our goal right now is just to start practicing informally and formally. So what do you do if you don't have time to do a practice? And this is valid for us. Sometimes we don't, we're really busy, or if you're a caregiver here, maybe you're, caring for lots of people at the same time. So realistically, I get that we don't always have time for practice. So I like to do very short practices that can have a big impact, okay? So this is one of my favorite ones, and you don't have to be able to, you can do this in different ways. So this is one called 2 feet, 1 breath. Now, for those of you who may not be able to have full sensation in feet, you can do this with your hands, or you can even just do it in your imagination. That's one of the cool things about mindfulness is the actual imagery is as important as the physical practice, because mindfulness is really all about thinking, right? It's all about the brain. So even if you aren't able to feel into a certain part of the body, by imagining it, you're still using the same circuits of the brain. So this is one of my favorite practices, particularly when someone is feeling really anxious, because when we focus on our feet, it's the furthest point away from our brains, right? And it also can be really grounding and help us get away from some of our negative thinking process. So let's try it, okay? And I'm going to invite you, I'm going to do a little experiment with you, I'm going to invite you first to think about something that's mildly anxious. So don't pick the most anxiety-provoking thing, but something mildly anxious. Maybe, here in the Northeast, I live in the Northeast, and we're going to have a big storm tonight. So the weather is going to be dicey. So, okay, so that's something like that. And so just kind of think about that situation. Maybe it's the high wind alert, right? That's for the Northeast. And you might even notice how that makes you feel when you think about this slightly anxious situation. So maybe for me, I notice, a little bit of tension in my chest, just a little shortness of breath, worried thought, I hope the power doesn't go out, whatever it is, right? So just take a moment to see what your situation is and how it affects you in your body. Now I'm going to invite you to do this practice, and you can either do it physically or through your mind in guided imagery. I'm going to invite you to feel or press into one of your feet, right? So if you're able to, you can press into one of your feet, just pressing it down. And if you're not able to, then I want you to imagine, or you can use a different body part too. You can use your hand, okay? So pressing into a foot, imagining pressing in, or using your hand. And then release. And then press into the other foot, or imagine pressing into the other foot and feeling that foot on the floor or against a chair. You can use your hand as well. and then release. And then just take a breath. That's it. It's a really simple practice, right? But what it does is it can help us move from that worried pattern just for a moment into the breath, into the body, and kind of turn on that network of the brain that we call the present-centered network. So it can be really helpful when we're gripped with worried thoughts to just get the mind focused on something else, particularly in the present moment. This is another technique that I love and I offer to many of my clients. It's called the stop technique. So I don't know about you, but I know for me, when I'm having a hard day, sometimes we're reactive, right? We may not have our best response to a situation, right? And so the stop technique can help us before we do or say something that we feel bad about afterward, right? Kind of that reactivity that comes when we're in that red zone, right? So the stop sign, I like to even imagine it in my mind right before I do it, is a way to break that reactivity briefly in the moment. So how do we do the stop sign? Well, first, it's just to stop, to literally stop what we're doing. So I often tell people, like, either remove yourself from the room. If you're standing, sit. If you're sitting, lay down. It's just like getting out of that, whatever you're doing, or turn off your computer if you're on your computer. Move away from whatever might be the agitating event. And then take a breath, or two, or three. And then observe your experience. And I invite people to name out loud, oh, I'm feeling angry, or I feel frustrated, or I'm worried, right? So as soon as we start to name what's happening, we're in the present moment, right? That part of the brain starts to activate and we're using different parts of the brain. We're out of that fight, flight, threat response. Just noticing, okay, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. And then sometimes I invite a question like, what do I need to move forward? Or what would be most helpful? And, maybe it's just, okay, I need to rest. Or maybe it's, I need to have a drink. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I'm thirsty. So we take a moment to think about what we need. And if we're not sure, we can just say, I'm not sure, right? But this stop technique gives us a moment to collect ourselves before we react. So we move from reacting from a hyper arousal to responding in a way that's much more mindful. I want to introduce one more short practice. So the 2 feet, 1 breath, the stop sign, and this supportive touch, these 3 can all be done in 30 seconds. They're fast, right? So even if you don't have time to do a regular practice, these are easy practices that you can use on the fly. So one thing that's really helpful when you're gripped with a difficult feeling, whether it's sadness, anger, frustration, being down on yourself, whatever the feeling is to give yourself soothing touch. And again, if you don't have the ability to actually use your own hand, you can imagine it, right? So we're going to use either an imagined or your own hand. And if you have a caregiver, your caregiver can also do this for you if that is helpful. So supportive self-touch is a way to help yourself. It's very calming to our nervous system to feel touch, right? That's why petting our dogs and our cats can feel so relieving, right? It's relieving to them, but it's relieving to us too. Touch helps, and imagining touch helps, right? So feeling the support even in your own mind's eye. So when we do that, it actually can initiate a cascade of positive hormones, oxytocin, which is the feel-good hormone. Think about a baby. When we're rocking a baby, we bring a baby off into our chest, right? It's very soothing. So if we can use soothing touch, and we can do this sometimes with a soft blanket, we can do this with even a breath buddy, a stuffed animal. So we don't even need to actually have a human touch. Just a tactile sensation can be really, really reassuring. So what do we do? So basically, I'll show you using my hand, but we can do any other way as well. We can imagine or use our own hand on our heart. And just taking a few moments to breathe. Us to recognize this is a difficult moment. We might even gently breathe and acknowledge, oh, this is difficult right now. So these are very short practices, but give us a way to attend to ourselves, right? Attend in a way that might be different than beating ourselves up or getting really upset, right? All right, so just a couple more slides and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So where do we begin? So sometimes people like to use guided apps. So I'm a big fan of guided apps. Some are free, which are the ones I really like. Calm is one, Insight Timer. If you go on YouTube and you can find many different kinds of guided meditation. For some people, just listening to sounds like sounds of the ocean or your favorite music, letting that take you on a meditative journey. So there's no right or wrong way to do any of these practices. It's just your intention to be in the present moment, right? So you can find whatever works for you. For some people, it's looking at a beach scene on YouTube, right? That works. The goal is to start with short practices and build it slowly. Do it with loved ones. So, bring in your partners, your pets. My dogs have done lots of mindfulness with me. So they often fall asleep when I'm guiding a practice. It's really the commitment to yourself. Can I try to weave it in formally and informal, and then online, so many different kinds of supports. And of course, through Synapticure, we offer our behavioral health services, including me, one of the psychologists. We do individual work with people. I'm starting my first group, so we're going to be doing a mindfulness group. So if you're interested, please let us know. So our first group's going, and then we're going to offer additional groups for folks to get together and go a little bit deeper into some of these practices. So it can make a big difference in how you feel. And I'm so glad you got to do a few of them tonight. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and check out the Q&A. All right, I see someone asked, is there a way to, if you're sleepy, if you're feeling really sleepy when you're practicing and you want to stay awake, it can be really helpful to open your eyes. So that's one of the things I like to do. If you're feeling like the meditation is making you want to totally go to sleep, is you can open your eyes. It can help to sit upright if you're able. And sometimes doing mindfulness practice with eyes open helps you to stay a little bit more engaged. Some people, let's see. Yeah, so, I know I'm reading a couple of people say that it's really hard to want to practice, that you might need to distract yourself at times. What I invite you to do is you can do a practice, even just 30 seconds of a little practice. And it can be helpful to talk to a counselor for sure if you're struggling with how to do it. But my feeling is start small, doing a few 30-second practices a day, or even something simple like washing your hands or brushing your teeth, just noticing the sensations. Those are ways to begin to strengthen the tool of mindfulness without necessarily going into it for long periods of time. For some people, that is a really helpful place to start. Someone said, shouldn't I get frustrated so I shouldn't get frustrated with my husband when I ask him to listen to Jon Kabat-Zinn when he falls asleep. It's not a waste of time. Honestly, I feel like any moment where we can do a little bit of practice is good, and falling asleep is okay. If someone falls asleep, we have to trust that their bodies are tired. And even if they do 3 or 4 minutes of practice, that is excellent. Those are 3 or 4 minutes that their brain is in a different pattern, right? So the goal for mindfulness is not to make it a to-do list, have to, or way to beat ourselves up. We're all doing the best we can, right? So we want to really focus on that. Want to be kind to ourselves. Mindfulness is a kind practice. It's not a way to judge ourselves or judge other people. Yeah, there is a way that anyone can do a practice. We just have to customize it, okay? So yeah, apps, I talked a little bit about that before. I love the Calm app. There's a breathing app. If you go onto YouTube, there are many different practices. Jon Kabat-Zinn has many practices, including the body scan. There are loving kindness practices that are really helpful. So there are many, many different kinds of practices that you can use. All right. So I know we're coming to the end. So when we start doing groups, we're going to be starting a group. It'll be a 4-week group where we do practice and sharing. So a little bit like we did tonight, but in more depth, we'll be going through some specific mindfulness practices, kind of like a core set of practices, and then talk about how to do them, challenges, and do some sharing as well. So the idea is to build some community and also have a little fun. Mindfulness does not need to be grim or boring. It can be fun. I like to really use it as an opportunity to enjoy and to really find what works for you. So, yeah, I think that's largely it. Dr. Ferluga, any final things you'd like to say?
Oh, I was just going to thank you for this lovely presentation. I think mindfulness is really important, and I don't know, my reading on it had been that you had to spend a lot of time. I know that most people can't fit that in. So I loved that you gave us a couple tools that were very brief. I wondered if you'd ever done any mindfulness with your group, like doing with food, like with a chocolate, or like having that taste experience and how that feels.
I have, and sometimes that's how I will hook people in, is I hand out chocolate. So if we were in person, I might be handing out Hershey Kisses. Yeah, you can use food. And Dr. Ferluga, you may be able to turn your camera on now. I'm just trying to.
Okay.
You can definitely use, yeah, there you are. You can use food, like a chocolate or a raisin or anything as a way, any of the senses, whether it's a smell, a taste, can be a really helpful way to practice mindfulness. So I encourage people even to sit and have one meal a day without their phone or TV and just really notice what you're eating. It's also a weight loss technique, because when we pay attention to what we're eating, we tend to eat less. So yeah, I love using food as one of the sensory ways to be present.
I used to have my own little mindfulness quick trick when I was seeing patients in person. Was I would get hand sanitizer and kind of feel the hand sanitizer, smell it, take a deep breath before I go in and see the next patient. I didn't realize that really was a mindfulness technique until you were talking tonight. So I really appreciate all the information.
Yeah, the senses. So, the senses, whether it's tactile, smell, taste, all and hearing, like we did that practice tonight, all of those sensory objects can be part of a mindfulness practice, because sensory information is present. That's in the present moment, right? So yeah, I love that. Yeah, hand sanitizer, something so simple, brushing our teeth, washing dishes. All of those can be dreaded things, or they can be, part of a mindfulness practice. All right. I really appreciate everybody's attendance tonight and everyone's willingness to practice a few things. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Synapticure. Those of you who are interested in doing a little bit more mindfulness work, that's part of our behavioral health services. And so we would love to teach you and practice with you more. So I really appreciate that. And thank you to Dr. Ferluga for hanging in there and we made it. We finally got us both on screen, and look forward to seeing everybody in the near future. So hopefully you can tuck away 1 or 2 practices to do tonight before you go to bed. Maybe the chocolate one, but anyway, whatever feels nurturing this evening. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much. On behalf of Synapticure, we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care. Bye.